Welcome to boring history where the past may sound dull, but the truth is far stranger than fiction. Today, we uncover the strangest military tactics ever used, strategies so unbelievable they actually changed the course of wars. From odd deceptions to unexpected twists. These stories prove that victory isn't always about strength, it's about outsmarting the enemy. Psychological warfare has always been one of the most fascinating yet underestimated elements in the history of human conflict. For wars are not merely won with swords, bullets, or cannons, but often with the manipulation of the mind. From the earliest days of tribal skirmishes to the global wars of the modern era, commanders and leaders have sought ways to weaken the enemy's morale, instill fear, and sow confusion long before the physical clash even began. The strange part about psychological warfare is that while it may sound intangible, its effects are very real, shaping the decisions of kings, generals, and soldiers who believed they were acting rationally, but were often dancing on the strings of carefully designed manipulations. To understand how psychological warfare evolved, one must journey through examples scattered across different ages of history, where fear, rumor, deception, and spectacle were wielded as weapons sharper than any blade. One of the earliest and most striking uses of psychological tactics comes from the ancient world, where armies often relied on appearance and sound to terrify their opponents. In battles between ancient Mesopotamian or Assyrian armies, soldiers painted their bodies, wore terrifying masks, and marched with loud drums and horns that echoed across valleys, giving the impression of overwhelming size and divine favor. To an enemy watching from the other side, the combination of monstrous faces, unnatural noises, and rhythmic chanting could easily convince them that they faced not mere mortals, but demons or spirits. The brilliance of such tactics lay in their simplicity. Before the fight even began, the enemy's courage could crumble, leading to panicked retreats or a complete collapse of order. The Greeks and Romans, masters of both military science and theater, elevated psychological warfare to a sophisticated art. The Greeks understood that reputation itself was a weapon, and tales of Spartan ferocity or Athenian cunning often preceded them to the battlefield, instilling doubt in adversaries. The Spartans in particular cultivated an aura of fear. Their disciplined silence in the face of enemy taunts created an unsettling contrast to the chaos of most pre-battle shouting matches. This silence was unnerving precisely because it suggested supreme confidence, the calm of predators ready to strike. On the Roman side, psychological warfare took many forms, from the deliberate display of overwhelming numbers in tight formations to the use of propaganda. Julius Caesar was a master of using words as weapons, penning accounts of his campaigns in Gaul not only to justify his actions politically, but also to intimidate opponents by exaggerating his victories and presenting himself as invincible. The Roman legions also marched with such order and precision that their very presence seemed mechanical and unstoppable, a living machine designed to crush anything in its path, and to many barbarian tribes, the psychological weight of facing Rome was often heavier than the actual clash of swords. Moving eastward, ancient China developed a profound philosophy around psychological manipulation in warfare, much of it codified in Sun Tzu's The Art of War. Sun Tzu argued that the greatest victory was one achieved without fighting, through deception, espionage, and the breaking of enemy morale. Chinese commanders employed elaborate ruses such as feigned retreats, ambushes, and false displays of weakness to lure enemies into traps. One famous story tells of General Zhu Zhiliang, who found himself cornered with only a handful of soldiers inside a city. Instead of preparing for desperate combat, he ordered the gates to be flung open and sat calmly atop the city wall, playing a lute. When the enemy arrived, they were so convinced that this was a trap. Surely no one so calm could truly be vulnerable, that they retreated rather than attack. In this moment, a single man's display of composure and cunning saved thousands of lives, proving that in the theater of war, appearances can outweigh reality. Psychological warfare also thrived in the use of symbols and omens. Throughout history, commanders exploited the deep superstitions of their men and their enemies. During Alexander the Great's campaigns, there are accounts of how he manipulated prophecies to his advantage, ranging from favorable interpretations from oracles or staging signs that appeared to confirm divine approval of his actions. Soldiers who believed they marched under the will of the gods fought with greater zeal, while their enemies, convinced that fate itself opposed them, often faltered. In the Middle Ages, banners and relics carried into battle functioned as psychological anchors, rallying troops and striking dread into foes. The sight of the Christian cross or the crescent moon banner could be enough to sway morale dramatically, regardless of the actual balance of forces. Fear was not only instilled through spiritual means, but also through sheer brutality. The Mongols, under Genghis Khan and his successors, perfected terror as a deliberate strategy. They cultivated a reputation for merciless destruction, annihilating entire cities and leaving survivors to spread tales of horror. Word traveled faster than armies, and often towns surrendered without a fight simply to avoid the fate that had befallen others. The Mongols understood that terror multiplied their strength many times over, saving them from costly battles. Their use of psychological warfare was systematic. They would massacre one city as an example, then allow refugees to flee and tell others of the bloodshed, ensuring that resistance in the next city would be minimal. At the same time, the Mongols spread misinformation, exaggerating their numbers and movements to confuse and paralyze their adversaries. Their psychological grip on Asia and parts of Europe was so strong that their reputation alone preceded them for generations. During the Crusades, psychological tactics were again on full display. Richard the Lionheart was famed not just for his bravery, but for the image of invincibility he projected. Saladin, his great opponent, likewise cultivated a reputation of chivalry and strength, ensuring his enemies saw him not merely as a warrior but as a near-mythical figure. In many ways, the psychological duel between leaders was as important as the battles themselves, with propaganda, symbolism, and personal image shaping the morale of entire armies. Even the way prisoners were treated could serve as a weapon. Kindness could sway loyalties, while cruelty could terrify foes into submission. As warfare entered the gunpowder age, psychological strategies adapted to new technologies. Cannons and muskets were not just physical weapons, they were terrifying spectacles. The thunder of cannon fire and the sight of massive walls crumbling shattered the mental defenses of defenders who had once believed their fortresses impregnable. European powers also learned to use uniforms and disciplined drills as psychological tools, projecting an image of order and professionalism that less organized foes found intimidating. The red-coated British soldiers, for instance, became synonymous with power, their uniformity conveying a sense of invulnerability even when they marched into hostile territory. When we examine modern conflicts, we see that psychological warfare reached new levels of sophistication. During the First World War, propaganda was unleashed on an industrial scale. Posters, pamphlets, and films were produced not only to recruit soldiers, but to demonize the enemy, making them appear as monsters or beasts rather than fellow humans. This dehumanization was itself a psychological tactic designed to harden, resolve, and justify the unimaginable carnage. In the trenches, psychological warfare took the form of night raids, gas attacks, and the constant threat of artillery bombardments, which wore down soldiers mentally as much as physically. The uncertainty of death, the sound of shells whistling overhead, and the ever-present fear of chemical weapons broke men's minds even when their bodies remained intact. World War II escalated psychological warfare further, blending deception, propaganda, and technological displays. Hitler's regime relied heavily on orchestrated rallies, symbols like the swastika, and grandiose speeches to instill both devotion among followers and fear among enemies. At the same time, Allied operations used deception to an extraordinary degree, such as Operation Bodyguard, which misled the Nazis about the location of the DID invasion by constructing fake armies, using double agents, and planting false intelligence. The ability to make the enemy believe in an illusion became as powerful as any bomb. Meanwhile, psychological campaigns targeted civilian populations as well, with bombings intended not just to destroy infrastructure, but to break the will of nations to resist. The Cold War introduced a new dimension to psychological warfare: the battle of ideologies. Propaganda became global, and fear itself was weaponized through the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. Neither the United States nor the Soviet Union wanted direct conflict, but both relied on psychological tactics to gain influence. From spreading their ideologies through media to using espionage and misinformation to destabilize rivals, the threat of nuclear war loomed constantly, and the psychological toll of living under that shadow shaped generations. Psychological warfare extended beyond the battlefield into diplomacy, culture, and even space exploration, where victories like the moon landing were as much about mental dominance as scientific achievement. Since the dawn of warfare, humans have looked beyond their own ingenuity and strength to harness the unpredictable forces of nature and the power of animals, transforming them into tools of conflict in ways both ingenious and bizarre. The battlefield was never only about men and their weapons, for commanders soon realized that the world around them could be weaponized. From stampeding herds unleashed upon enemies to fiery creatures turned into living bombs, and even the manipulation of weather itself, history offers an astonishing record of how nature was drafted into the service of war. To understand this strange tradition is to witness the creativity, desperation, and brutality of human beings as they sought every possible advantage to outwit their adversaries. One of the earliest examples lies with elephants, the colossal beasts that became synonymous with terror on the battlefield. Used extensively by Indian and later Carthaginian armies, elephants were not only physically destructive, but psychologically devastating. When Hannibal famously led his elephants across the Alps to confront Rome, the act itself was as much a psychological strike as a tactical maneuver. The Romans, accustomed to fighting men, suddenly found themselves staring into the faces of enormous creatures that could crush soldiers underfoot and scatter cavalry with a single charge. The sheer size, the trumpeting sounds, and the sight of an advancing wall of living muscle inspired dread that rippled through enemy ranks. The truth was that elephants were unpredictable, prone to panic, and often as dangerous to their own handlers as to the enemy. But in the right moment, their presence alone could turn the tide of battle. Other animals were weaponized in more creative ways. Dogs, for example, were trained for war in many cultures. Ancient Greeks, Romans, and even medieval armies used mastiff-like breeds armored with spiked collars or small plates of metal, turning them into living weapons. These war dogs were unleashed to break enemy lines, chase down fleeing soldiers, or guard camps at night. In some instances, they carried small incendiary devices attached to their backs, meant to ignite when they charged into enemy fortifications. The use of animals in this way blurred the line between loyal companion and expendable weapon, showing how necessity could twist the bond between humans and creatures into something far more grim. Birds, too, were drawn into warfare. Carrier pigeons became indispensable tools of communication, particularly in the modern era. But in earlier times, birds were sometimes used in deceptive or destructive ways. Ancient armies tied burning materials to the legs of birds and released them near enemy towns, knowing the creatures would instinctively fly back to their nests, often located in thatched roofs or wooden structures. The unintended arson that followed could devastate entire settlements. In the Middle Ages, similar tactics were reportedly used, with doves or sparrows turned into unwitting incendiaries. To a besieged city already low on morale, the sudden outbreak of fire caused by an uncontrollable source would have been terrifying, magnifying the psychological chaos, even if the actual damage was limited. Beyond animals, nature itself was bent into a weapon through cunning manipulation. Armies have long used rivers, forests, and even weather as allies in combat. Flooding an enemy was one of the most effective natural tactics available to ancient civilizations with access to water control. The Chinese became masters of this, breaching dikes and redirecting rivers to drown enemy camps or cut off advancing armies. Entire battles were decided not by swords clashing, but by the rush of water sweeping away men, horses, and supplies. Where I go to have the battle out, I give it all way war. When I So the same why guy I why weak deliberately flooding their own lands to halt invading forces. Though destructive to their own territory, it saved their people from conquest, proving that nature could be more decisive than any army. Weather, too, could be exploited. Some of the most pivotal moments in history turned on the unpredictable forces of storms. And winds and cunning leaders often framed these natural events as deliberate weapons in their favor. The divine wind, or kamikaze, that destroyed the Mongol fleets invading Japan in the 13th century became enshrined as proof that nature itself fought on Japan's side. While the Mongols' defeat owed more to the vulnerability of their ships in typhoon conditions, the psychological impact was immense, convincing generations that divine protection was woven into Japan's destiny. Commanders elsewhere also tried to time their attacks with seasonal rains, snow, or winds, ensuring that nature did half the work for them. Insects, those smallest of creatures, were also pressed into military service in ways that sound almost too strange to believe. In antiquity, defenders of cities sometimes hurled beehives or hornet nests at besieging forces, creating chaos in the ranks as soldiers scattered from stinging swarms. During naval battles, similar tactics were used, with clay pots filled with bees or scorpions catapulted onto enemy decks, transforming the chaos of combat into sheer panic as men struggled against both human foes and natural tormentors. The Romans and Greeks documented such practices, noting that the psychological and physical disruption caused by a sudden onslaught of insects was far out of proportion to the simplicity of the tactic. Fire, one of humanity's oldest tools, was often combined with animals to create even more horrifying weapons. Accounts from antiquity describe pigs coated in pitch or tar, set aflame, and released toward war elephants. The squeals of the burning animals and the sight of fire terrified the elephants, who would often panic and trample their own lines in retreat. This gruesome method demonstrated not only the ingenuity, but also the cruelty of ancient warfare, as humans sacrificed animals in horrific ways to achieve tactical gains. Fire ships, another adaptation of this idea, used the sea itself as a stage. Vessels loaded with combustible materials were set alight and sent drifting into enemy fleets, turning the very medium of naval power into a weapon of chaos. Though not animals, these fire ships worked on the same principle of using uncontrollable, natural forces, wind, current, flame to magnify destruction. During the Middle Ages, armies sought even stranger natural weapons. Diseased corpses were hurled over city walls during sieges, spreading plague and rot among the defenders. This grim tactic, though human-centered, relied on nature's invisible forces, bacteria, and contagion to do what armies could not. The Mongols are infamously recorded as catapulting plague-infected bodies into Kaffa in the 14th century, an act some historians link to the eventual spread of the Black Death into Europe. Though unintentional in its broader consequences, it shows how war has always sought to weaponize the unseen powers of the natural world, regardless of the cost. In the Renaissance and early modern period, animals continued to find themselves on the front lines. Horses had always been essential to cavalry, but they, too, could be turned into instruments of shock beyond mere transport. Cavalry charges relied not only on speed and momentum, but also on the sheer terror of massive animals bearing down upon foot soldiers. Pike formations were invented largely to resist this frightening spectacle, showing that entire tactical systems were shaped around the psychological and physical power of animals. Camels were also employed in desert warfare, their smell known to unsettle horses, giving armies that used them an advantage in disrupting enemy cavalry. The Ottomans and Persians, aware of this natural aversion, integrated camels strategically into their forces to counter mounted opponents. As warfare modernized, the use of animals did not disappear, but shifted in form. In both world wars, animals were indispensable, though not always in ways one might imagine. Horses, though gradually replaced by vehicles, still hauled artillery and supplies in difficult terrain. Dogs served as messengers, guards, and even medical assistants, carrying supplies, or locating the wounded. Pigeons once again carried critical communications, with stories of single birds saving hundreds of lives by delivering messages under fire. In desperate times, more experimental uses emerged. During World War II, bats were outfitted with tiny incendiary bombs in an American project known as bat bombs. The idea was to release swarms of bats over Japanese cities where they would roost in wooden structures before the timers detonated. Though the project was never deployed, tests showed the terrifying potential, as bats carrying explosives inadvertently burned down a U.S. airbase hangar. Dolphins and sea lions were later trained during the Cold War to detect mines or enemy divers, demonstrating that even in the age of nuclear weapons, humans continued to look toward animals as allies in warfare. Nature itself was manipulated in even stranger ways in modern times. During the Vietnam War, the United States used a program known as Operation Popeye to attempt weather modification, stealing clouds to extend the monsoon season and disrupt enemy supply lines along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Though its effectiveness remains debated, the attempt itself highlights how the human desire to weaponize natural forces has persisted. At the same time, guerrilla fighters used the jungle itself as a weapon, laying traps, exploiting terrain, and allowing the oppressive climate to weaken technologically superior opponents. The line between human strategy and natural force blurred, as the environment became as deadly as bullets. What emerges from these countless stories is a picture of warfare where animals and nature were never passive backdrops but active participants. Drafted into service in ways often ingenious, sometimes grotesque, and always revealing of the extremes humans would go to for survival or victory. Throughout the long story of human conflict, some of the most decisive victories did not come from sheer numbers or superior weapons, but from the daring use of unorthodox strategies that no one expected. The history of warfare is filled with examples where commanders who refused to follow conventional wisdom and instead took strange, unpredictable approaches managed to change the course of battles, kingdoms, and even civilizations. These moments remind us that victory often belongs not to the strongest, but to the most inventive, those willing to take risks that seemed absurd at the time but left enemies baffled and unprepared. What makes such strategies truly fascinating is how they relied on imagination as much as steel, on surprise as much as courage, and on deception as much as brute force. One of the earliest examples can be found in the Trojan War, with the legendary use of the Trojan horse. Whether myth or embellished memory, the concept itself represents the essence of unorthodox warfare. A gift transformed into a hidden weapon, an enemy deceived into defeating itself. The Greeks, unable to breach Troy after years of siege, resorted to trickery so bold it has echoed for millennia. To the Trojans, the giant wooden horse seemed a symbol of surrender and tribute, but within it lay warriors ready to open the gates once night fell. The strategy bypassed walls, armies, and years of stalemate, proving that creativity could achieve what brute force could not. Even if the story has mythological elements, it embodies the principle of using the enemy's expectations against them, a theme that repeats across countless real battles in history. Another striking instance comes from Alexander the Great, whose genius lay not just in his ambition, but in his ability to outthink his opponents in ways they never anticipated. At the Battle of Gaugamela, faced with a Persian army vastly larger than his own, Alexander deliberately left gaps in his lines, seemingly an error that invited attack. The Persians surged forward to exploit what they thought was weakness, only to be drawn into a trap as Alexander's forces enveloped them. What looked like disorder was in fact carefully calculated, a use of controlled chaos to manipulate the enemy's choices. This willingness to appear vulnerable in order to lure opponents into overconfidence was a hallmark of unorthodox strategy, and it reshaped the balance of empires. The Roman world, too, was defined by moments of tactical audacity that seemed illogical yet proved decisive. Hannibal's campaign against Rome stands as one of the greatest demonstrations of unconventional warfare. Marching his army, including elephants, across the Alps was itself an unthinkable maneuver, bypassing Rome's expectations of where an attack might come from. Once in Italy, Hannibal repeatedly defeated Rome's legions through unexpected tactics. At Cannae, he deliberately allowed his center to appear weak, drawing the Romans inward before encircling them with stronger flanks, annihilating one of the largest armies Rome ever fielded. The strategy was so shocking that it became a classic study of the double envelopment, showing how turning an opponent's strength against them could devastate even the mightiest power in the medieval era. Unorthodox strategies often involved deception and sudden mobility. The Mongols, masters of steppe warfare, excelled in pretending to flee, only to turn and counterattack once their pursuers were strung out and disorganized. This feigned retreat was a dangerous tactic, for any sign of genuine panic could turn it into disaster, but the Mongols perfected it into an art. Time and again, enemies who believed they had broken the nomadic horsemen fell into deadly traps, ambushed and surrounded when they thought victory was at hand. This simple yet brilliant tactic allowed the Mongols to conquer vast territories with smaller numbers, rewriting the map of Eurasia not through brute force alone, but through the psychological and strategic manipulation of their foes' assumptions. Other unorthodox approaches relied on using the environment in startling ways. During the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, Henry V of England faced overwhelming French forces. Rather than relying on sheer strength, he used the muddy terrain to his advantage, positioning his longbowmen where the French cavalry would be slowed and disorganized. The result was a slaughter that defied expectations, with common archers breaking the power of France's nobility. The victory was less about weapons than about recognizing how to twist the conditions of battle into a hidden ally. In this way, Henry's use of mud and positioning turned what should have been a hopeless fight into one of the most legendary triumphs in English history. Naval warfare, too, was transformed by surprising and unorthodox strategies. The Battle of Salamis in 480 BCE saw the smaller Greek fleet outmaneuver the vast Persian armada by luring it into narrow straits where numbers became a disadvantage. Instead of confronting the enemy directly, Themistocles recognized that the geography itself could be a weapon. By drawing the Persians into confined waters, he turned their advantage into a liability, allowing nimble Greek ships to ram and sink their opponents. The victory not only preserved Greek independence, but also demonstrated that unconventional thinking could rewrite the fate of civilizations. During the Renaissance and early modern period, strange and clever strategies continued to dominate. In 1588, when the Spanish Armada threatened England, it was not sheer force that saved the island, but the cunning use of fireships. English sailors sent burning vessels into the tightly anchored Spanish fleet, causing chaos and scattering their formation. The Armada, once seen as invincible, was undone not by direct combat, but by an unexpected and unconventional weapon that preyed on panic as much as fire. Such tactics remind us that often the strangest ideas can undo even the most powerful opponents. The Napoleonic Wars were full of unconventional brilliance as well. Napoleon himself thrived on a maneuver, repeatedly confounding enemies by moving faster than seemed possible and appearing where he was least expected. At the Battle of Austerlitz, he feigned weakness by abandoning the high ground, luring the Allies to overextend themselves before crushing them with a sudden counterattack. His genius was not merely in numbers or firepower, but in breaking the script of traditional warfare, keeping his enemies in a constant state of uncertainty. This unorthodox willingness to risk appearing weak reshaped European politics and left military strategists studying his methods for generations in more modern conflicts. Unorthodox strategies have only grown stranger. During the American Civil War, General Sherman's march to the sea represented a radical departure from traditional campaigns. Instead of focusing solely on defeating enemy armies, Sherman targeted the infrastructure and morale of the South, cutting a swath of destruction that crippled the Confederate war effort. It was a recognition that wars are fought not just on battlefields, but in the minds and resources of entire populations. By waging total war in such a shocking way, Sherman's campaign helped bring the conflict to an end faster than conventional fighting might have achieved. The 20th century pushed unorthodox warfare into even more creative directions. Guerrilla tactics, employed by smaller forces against empires, repeatedly changed history. In Vietnam, the Viet Cong relied not on open battles, but on ambushes, tunnels, and traps that turned the jungle into a nightmare for conventional armies. Similarly, in colonial struggles across Africa and Asia, local fighters who lacked heavy weapons relied on speed, mobility, and surprise, rewriting the rules of conflict against technologically superior powers. These unorthodox methods demonstrated that determination and ingenuity could outmatch industrial might. forever altering the balance between empires and the colonized World War II, saw some of the most daring and unusual strategies ever attempted. The German blitzkrieg itself was unorthodox at the time, relying on fast-moving tanks, aircraft, and coordinated assaults that bypassed strongpoints and sowed panic. On the Allied side, operations like the DID deception campaigns showed how unconventional thinking could decide the fate of millions. Inflatable tanks, fake radio chatter, and double agents convinced Hitler that the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy, ensuring that German defenses were unprepared when the real attack began. It was a triumph not only of force but of imagination, proving once again that wars can be won as much by misdirection as by firepower, even in the nuclear age. Unorthodox strategies remained critical. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the resolution came not from direct confrontation, but from a delicate game of hidden negotiations and back-channel deals, an unorthodox diplomatic maneuver that prevented catastrophe. In asymmetric conflicts of the late 20th and 21st centuries, unconventional tactics like cyber warfare, terrorism, and information manipulation became central, shifting the battlefield into realms no general of the past could have imagined. These strategies, unbound by traditional rules, demonstrate how war evolves constantly through the willingness of some to defy expectations and craft new methods of attack. What unites all these examples across thousands of years is the willingness of commanders and leaders to abandon conventional wisdom and embrace risk, creativity, and deception. They reveal that history has often been shaped less by overwhelming power than by the strange and unexpected, the bold decisions that opponents could not anticipate. The ideas that seemed too unorthodox to succeed, yet ended up rewriting the destinies of nations and peoples.